Anglo-Saxon houses were wooden huts with roofs thatched in straw. There was only one room where everyone ate, cooked, slept, entertained friends, and even kept some of the farm animals, but these huts likely got added to and improved with each new generation. They were built facing the sun to soak up as much warmth and light as they could. The layout was open and square, not round like the old Britain houses. They'd start with a timber frame, then cover it in wooden planks. Wattle and daub walls were also common, a mix of wet soil, clay, sand, animal muck and straw, all packed round woven sticks. The windows were narrow slits called eye holes. Most huts had no glass. If they had windows at all, they were just small slits to let in a bit of light. The floor was just dirt, usually scattered with rushes pulled from the riverbanks. There'd have been a central fire used for both cooking and heating, and the whole house was often dug into the ground a bit to help keep the warmth in. They may have had looms for making clothes and fabric, along with wooden buckets and clay pots for collecting water, storing food, and dealing with waste. They might have sat on benches. Shields and antlers hung on the walls, and animal skins, and maybe tapestries, lined the inside for warmth and a bit of decoration. Dice and other tabletop games have been found, even buried with people. So it's fair to say, gambling was common and meant a lot to people. The biggest house in an Anglo-Saxon village was the hall, the chief's place. He lived there with his warriors. The hall was long, wide and smoky, with a fire set on a stone in the middle. The smoke drifted out through a hole in the roof. Sometimes the oxen were kept down at one end of the hall. The average Anglo-Saxon settlement looked somewhat like this. First, the houses. They were laid out in loose clusters, not all neat and tidy in rows, but scattered about with open spaces between, like folk just built where suited them best. The bigger houses belonged to the lords or the folks with more standing, bit longer, sturdier, with maybe more room for kin or gatherings. The smaller ones were for regular folk, like farmers or workers, just simple, one-room huts, enough for a family to sleep, cook, and keep out the cold. In the middle of it all, there were usually a big communal hall. That were the heart of the settlement. Folk came together there for feasts, meetings, or to settle disputes. It were bigger than any of the houses, built strong with timber, and it showed who were in charge. Some houses were used by artisans, folk like blacksmiths, potters, or weavers. They'd work out of their homes, so part of the house got turned into a little shop or workshop. You'd see tools out front, maybe goods on display, and folk coming by to trade or buy what they needed. It weren't like big town markets, but trade still went on, right there in the settlement. Some of the communal halls were mead halls too. They served both purposes, place for folk to gather, and where the lord held his feasts. So one building could be where you settled disputes by day, then drank and sang by night. Sometimes folk kept their livestock right in the house with them, especially in the colder months. One end of the house were for the family, other end for the animals, like pigs, chickens, maybe a cow if they had one. It kept the animals safe and their body heat helped warm the place up. Weren't much for smell, but they were used to it. When weather were better, they kept the livestock out in the fields round the edge of the settlement. There'd be open grazing land, maybe a few rough fences or ditches to keep animals from wandering. Folk had to keep an eye out though. Wolves were still about back then, and someone nicking a sheep weren't unheard of either. Most settlements were built on or near a river. People needed water for cooking and washing, and rivers made travel and trade easier too. You'd often find a shallow spot where they could cross, or a little landing where boats could pull up. Plus, being near water meant better soil for growing crops. The fields were usually just outside the settlement. They worked them daily, ploughing, sowing and harvesting when season came. They grew things like barley, wheat and oats. Some fields were shared by the whole village, split into strips so each family had their bit. You'd see oxen pulling ploughs, and folk out there from first light to sundown. There were often a church nearby, sometimes right in the settlement, sometimes a bit off to one side. Early on it were just a small wooden building, but later some were built from stone, stood out proper against the rest of the timber houses. It were where people went to pray, hear sermons, and mark big moments like births, weddings and funerals. Even in smaller villages the church had a strong presence. Pagans, however, preferred the woods to worship. Rough tracks or dirt roads ran out from the settlement, connecting it to the outside world. They weren't like Roman roads, more like worn paths, shaped by foot traffic, carts and livestock over time. Traders, messengers, even the odd traveller passed through, bringing news or goods from other villages and towns. It kept folk from being too cut off. Most settlements had a well dug near the centre, close to where folk lived. It were the main source of clean water, especially if the river were too far or not safe to drink from. People came with buckets every day, and it were a place where you'd often see folk chatting while they waited their turn. Kept covered too to stop dirt, or worse, getting in. There were usually stables near the edge of the settlement or close to the mead hall if the lord had horses. They were simple wooden structures, just enough to keep the animals sheltered and tied up. Not everyone had horses, mind. Mostly the richer folk, or those who needed them for travel or work. You'd sometimes find pigs or goats kept nearby too, all penned up together. Life in an Anglo-Saxon settlement were hard but steady. They worked from sunup to sundown, tending fields, looking after animals, and mending what needed fixing. Most lived with their families in small smoky houses, eating what they grew or raised. Community mattered. People helped each other out, shared tools, told stories in the mead hall, and gathered for feast days or church. It weren't a life of comfort, but it had rhythm, rooted deep in the land, and in old ways passed down through the years.
Be sure to check out my other channel, History Sticks, for the complete, longer and comprehensive video.